please visit LibriVox.org. Canfield. Someone has said that these swamps of the South are its ghosts. They are, at any rate, fit dwelling places for ghosts if dismalness and unwholesomeness can make them so. It is a mixed question among people intimate with ghosts and versed in their manners and customs, why a ghost that was a sensible person in life should, after death, choose such uncomfortable places of residence as damp, mouldy churchyards, windy ruins, and the like. It is well known, however, to the above-mentioned ghost fanciers that they do particularly affect such haunts, and it must be allowed that nothing could be found to suit them better than a southern swamp. A great swamp is one of the dreariest scenes the eye of man ever rested on. Desolation covers it as with a pall. Even at noontide, semi-darkness and deathly silence reign there. Darkness and silence so weird and unnatural that an owl's hoot or vulture's hoarse croak break as startlingly on the ear as the crack of a pistol shot. Every tree is draped thick with funereal wreaths of Spanish moss. Every log and stump lies rotting in the pestilential damp. Every breath of air, every drop of water teems with malaria. It is the paradise of the serpent and the saurian, of all noxious and deadly things. Humanity has no business there. In just such a swamp I had the evil hap to lose myself towards the close of a winter's day in the 50s. I was a stranger, visiting an old college mate, and had been invited to join the gentlemen of the vicinity in a deer hunt. Being a novice, I was placed at a stand and told to remain there until the game was driven past me. I had not been stationed long before a fat buck dashed by. He came and was gone like a flash. Nevertheless, I banged away with a glorious disregard, alike of the improbability of hitting the deer and of the insecurity of my own seat on horseback. I was reminded of the latter by finding myself promptly deposited on the oozy soil, while my horse, with a contemptuous fling of his heels within an inch of my right ear, galloped away. Here was a pleasant predicament, alone and on foot in the middle of this hideous swamp. I had no horn to blow, and could not have blown one if I had it, but as a substitute shouted until I was hoarse. Distant calls or the echoes of my own voice came back from every direction, but in vain I waited and waited. Nobody came. Losing patience, I was foolish enough to leave the spot where I had been placed and set about trying to find my own way out of the swamp. I looked round. There was no lack of paths to follow, but the difficulty was that there were too many of them, as tracks of strayed cattle and wild hogs crossed and recrossed each other in bewildering plenty. I chose one haphazard, but it only wound round and at last landed me again at the starting point. I followed another, and it vanished in a hollow tree. A third ended in a mud-hole. In short, although I was as ignorant of woodcraft as a town-bred baby, it did not take long to convince me that I was hopelessly lost. On I floundered, wading through departed generations of rotting leaves, sinking mid-length in slush, or stumbling over cypress knees and breaking my own. It was now quite dark, and I was about giving up in despair, and looking round for the driest spot to be found on which to deposit my weary body until morning, when I caught a glimmer of light through the trees. "Humph," said I, "this is pleasant, wandering about this beastly swamp in company with a jack-o'-lantern." But the flame burned too steadily for a marsh light. Could I reach it, I wondered, without breaking my neck over logs and stumps, or pitching head foremost into some slimy bayou where I should infallibly furnish a supper for a dozen or so of hungry alligators? Advancing cautiously, I drew nearer the light, which grew larger and brighter, and shone red through the trees, as though seemingly from a large fire. Who could have kindled it? Surely no human being could be living in the heart of this pestilential jungle. I crept forward to the edge of a small clearing, popped my head round an intervening tree, and gazed upon blank darkness. A dilapidated log cabin stood in the center of the clearing, but where had the light vanished? I rubbed my eyes and stared again. Not a twinkle was visible. Only a minute since it stretched in a red line to my very feet. Now darkness reigned supreme. Taking at last my courage in both hands, I entered the cabin. It was in the last stages of dilapidation. The chinking had fallen from between the logs, the roof was partly gone, and the absence of anything like furniture showed that it had been unoccupied for a long time. Then who could have kindled that fire? Lighting a match, I examined the fireplace. Heaps of ashes caked with mold lay on the hearth, but not even a charred stick nor a sign of recent fire was visible. I gave up trying to solve the riddle, and set about making myself as comfortable as circumstances would permit. With the boards that had fallen from the roof and some dry branches picked up outside, I kindled a fire, but there was small store of fuel wherewith to fight the cold and darkness of a long winter's night. However, grumbling would not mend matters, so I speedily resolved to make the best of it. I reloaded my rifle, and then sat down on the ground close beside the hearth, and leaning my back against the logs, prepared to doze and watch alternately till daylight. It was not long before I lost myself in thoughts of my late companions, wondered if they were looking for me, wondered if they would find me in the morning, or if I was doomed to pass the remainder of my life in this dismal swamp, dozed, woke up, dozed again, and finally went fast asleep. When I awoke, it was with the feeling that I was shut up in an iceberg. Deadly cold palsied my limbs, froze my blood, and clogged the very beating of my heart. Yet the fire was not out, though it had burned down to a bed of hot live coals, and I sat close beside it. With an effort, like that with which we cast off the oppression of a nightmare, I seized what remained of the fuel and heaped it on the fire. I had no thought then of sparing it, for I felt that unless this fearful cold was overcome, I must quickly perish. The dry wood blazed up brightly, and as I cowered shivering over it, I thought I felt a touch on my shoulder. Startled, I looked around, but saw nothing. It must have been fancy, yet surely it felt very much like a heavy hand laid on me. As nothing further occurred, I sat down in front of the fire. Good God! What was that? Distinctly, I felt the clutch of a hand on my shoulder. It felt exactly as if somebody in a violent passion had seized me for the purpose of shaking the life out of me. With an exclamation, I sprang to my feet, prepared to grapple with my assailant. There was nothing to be seen. I stirred the fire to a brighter blaze and scanned every corner of the room, plainly visible in the strong light, but there was absolutely nothing. With a determined effort at composure, I set my teeth and clenched my hands, and strove with all my might to control the childish terror that possessed me. I even stamped my foot to convince myself that I was awake. Then I strode up and down the floor, and as I walked, another step kept pace with mine, and a touch from a clammy hand, now here, now there, showed that my invisible companion was close beside me. I felt as if I should soon go mad with the unspeakable horror of hearing and feeling that some sentient thing was near me, yet in that bright light, and in spite of all my efforts to see nothing. It would not be half as bad in the dark, I thought, for then I could believe this haunting thing was something real, tangible, anything. No matter how dangerous and deadly, so it were real. I was soon to prove the fallacy of this notion. The fire had been gradually dying down, and now with one last expiring flash went out. As the light diminished, I cowered closer to the flame and, crouched on the ground at one end of the hearth, tried to screw up my courage to meet whatever should happen next. Minutes passed. They seemed to me hours. The room was now densely dark, and I could not hear the slightest sound, yet all at once it struck me that someone was rekindling the fire. A faint glow came from the dead ashes into which my last piece of wood had resolved itself, and as I watched the spot breathlessly, the tiny flame broadened and brightened until the same strong red light I had seen from the outside diffused itself over the moldering walls and ceiling of the cabin. And now too sensible a light displaced the chill, clinging damp, and I saw that the fireplace was piled high with substantial logs. If at this time the flame had burned blue and emitted a strong odor of sulphur, I should not have been surprised. That would have been in keeping with the circumstances. But here was a good, honest fire that any chilled wayfarer might have been glad to warm his limbs at, with nothing ghostly about it. Who had kindled it? But now as I gazed, with eyes wide open, at the opposite side of the hearth, I saw an old man sitting in a big splint-bottomed chair. He leaned forward, his clasped hands resting on the top of a thick stick, gazing intently at the fire, and seemingly unconscious of my presence. I had, therefore, an opportunity to observe him closely. His vast frame showed that he must once have possessed a giant's strength. A thick mat of snow-white wool showed in startling contrast to a face as black as ebony and seamed with countless wrinkles, across which a long white scar cut from the left temple across the nose to the lobe of the right ear. He was dressed in a patched and ragged suit of homespun, the trouser legs hanging in fringes round his bare feet, and in a belt of undressed deerskin hung a long knife, its naked blade shining keen and cruel in the firelight. A runaway Negro, I thought, hiding in the swamp and housing in this shanty at night because it is 1 degree better than the swamp outside. He looks rather an uncanny customer, but I have my gun, and, after all, why should he wish to harm me? If he has been long in this horrible place, he ought to be glad to see even a white man's face. Here it struck me that the appearance of the cabin had unaccountably changed. I could see no open cracks in the walls. The roof was apparently whole. In one corner a bed of dried moss was piled. In another stood a rude bench on which were arranged a tin cup and plate, a skillet, and an iron pot. How and when in the name of goodness had these things got here? For not a sound had broken the deathly stillness for an hour. Now, somehow or other, I was mightily cheered and encouraged by the genial warmth and light of the fire and the homely look of the room, unaccountable as the transformation was, and still more by the presence of a human being in this ghastly solitude. All my ghostly terror vanished, and seeing that the old man was still gazing at the fire and taking no notice of me, I thought I would rouse him from his meditations and satisfy my curiosity as to these strange happenings. "Hallo, old man!" I exclaimed loudly and cheerily. "Who the deuce are you, and where did you and your fire and furniture spring from all at once?" The apparition in the big chair slowly straightened itself, and still leaning one hand on this stick, turned his eyes full on my face. Never until my dying day shall I forget that look. It was not alone the deadly malignity, the fiery hate, the almost maniacal ferocity flaming in those sunken eyes that froze my blood and made me shiver from head to foot. I had faced calmly many a greater danger than could threaten me from a weak old man. I could have met the spring of a tiger without that utter sinking of the spirit, that palsy of the nerves which now overcame me. There was a devilish spell in that gaze that struck the strength from my arm and the manhood from my heart. I was afraid. Yes, I was most horribly afraid of that poor old Negro. Never once did I think of my gun. In fact, I never once thought of defending myself, but simply cowered before him like a terror-stricken child. Slowly he rose, leaning on his stick. Slowly his great height towered up till it seemed to me his head touched the rafters. Slowly he crossed the room, drawing nearer and nearer to me, while I sat motionless, spellbound by the baleful fascination of those glaring eyes. He bent over me. An icy breath stirred my hair. Cold, clammy fingers clasped my throat, pressing, 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 until my tongue lolled from my mouth. My eyes seemed starting from my head, and blood burst from my ears and nostrils. Then sensation left me. I was as one dead. When consciousness returned to me, daylight was creeping into the old cabin, now empty and dilapidated as when I had first seen it. Not a sign remained of last night's vision, not even of the terrible throttling I had received. It all seemed like a dreadful dream. I was in sufficiently bad plight, however. My eyes and skin burned with incipient fever, every bone in me ached, and my head worst of all. I was so weakened by fasting, the oppressiveness of the air, and the fearful night I had passed, that I felt utterly incapable of exertion, and could only wait in pain and stupor until someone came to my relief. It was not until afternoon, however, that I was found. All efforts to follow my devious wanderings had failed, and my friends were forced to send to a distant plantation for bloodhounds to track me. But late as my deliverance came, I hailed it with a thankful heart, for I fully believed that I should not survive another night in that cabin, and, as it was, I had a pretty sharp attack of fever. When I was convalescent, my host said to me one day, "Pardon my curiosity, but you said some such queer things in your delirium that I want to ask you what really happened to you in old Goliath's cabin." "Goliath? Is that his name? Well, it suits him." "Suits whom?" asked my friend with an odd look at me. "The man I saw in the cabin that night, to be sure." And therewith I related my adventures. When I had finished, my host said thoughtfully, "Strange things do happen sometimes, even in this prosaic age, things inexplicable by any rule of common sense or reason. You cannot have dreamed this, and it is simply impossible that you can ever have seen or heard of the man you describe. Yet there can be no doubt as to his identity. The scar across his face would alone settle that, but your description is in every point singularly exact. Do you know that you have seen a ghost?" "Ghost? Nonsense. Maniac, if you will. That he is, I believe, but his fingers were quite too substantial for a ghost. I can feel them now, choking the life out of me." "Yet the fingers left no mark on your throat." "No, that is the strangest part of it. But ghosts, I have always heard, are impalpable. How could a ghost's hands throttle a man?" "Well, whatever it may have been, dream or vision, visitant from another world, or psychic mystery of this one, the fact remains that the man you saw has been dead for 20 years. He was a noted desperado and runaway, set every plantation law at defiance, and always evaded punishment by running off to the swamp. He spent most of his life there, and some years before his death he became insane, no doubt from the ghastly solitude in which he lived. Fancy the brute strength of a gorilla joined to a maniac's violence, and you can form some idea of what a terror he became. It was a simple matter of necessity to destroy him, for such were his cunning and ferocity that to take him alive was impossible, But it was not until he had killed or desperately wounded several of his assailants that he fell riddled with buckshot on the door-sill of his cabin. He was buried close by, and the negroes have ever since declared that his ghost haunts it. Freedom and $5,000 to boot would not tempt one of them to go near the place in broad daylight, and if compelled to pass a night there, the unwilling sojourner would be as crazy as Goliath himself before morning. But I think, on the whole, it was lucky for you that you encountered him in the spirit instead of the flesh, for so great was his hatred of a white man that he would no doubt have torn you to pieces. I pondered long and seriously over my friend's story, and finally accepted his theory, partly, perhaps, because it soothed my wounded vanity and sore sense of shame at the want of courage I had shown throughout that terrible night. At any rate, I was, and am now, convinced that my antagonist was no mere mortal like myself, but a veritable ghost, the ghost of the swamp.